Greetings. Greetings and welcome to Conversation with Tony Mobley. Today is July 1st, 2026. This is episode 214 of Conversations with Tony Mobley. 5 years of conversations. This conversation uses the TV broadcast software Mimo Live and Zoom. And just if you're curious about what Mimo Live is and you want to learn how to do it, we ask that you reach out to us on a YouTube chat or conversationswithTonyMobley.com, which is our website. We also have probably a QR code that's showing that says Mukana, and you can go there and you can ask questions in Mukana, and those questions will be voted up or down. So if you choose not to use Mukana, well, you can ask your questions in the YouTube chat. And we encourage you to ask your questions or make comments in YouTube chat. Our guest today is the author, Dr. Chloe Chapin. And she is here today to share in a conversation with me about her book, Suitable. And we're just going to get right into it today. We have a lot of questions that will come up, and we hope to get most of them in this hour. So we want to say hello, Dr. Chapin. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Tony.
I'm very happy to have you. And as I shared in our pre-show conversation, that I am going through your book now through an audio book, and I'm enjoying it immensely. And so we're going to get right into the very first question. Please give us a brief bio of who Dr. Chloe Chapin is.
You want a brief one, huh? Uh, so I was trained as an artist. I mostly worked as a theatrical costume designer. But even before that, I was really a maker. So I was a carpenter and a welder, and I learned how to sew, and I learned how to paint. So that was really my background, was making stuff and being creative and putting on plays. That was always the through line. And I taught fashion history for a while in New York City at the Fashion Institute of Technology. My students were all fashion designers, and I was teaching them fashion history. And I realized how much of the research part of the production process I really liked. But in theater, it's always so fast, you never really have time to really sink into anything and do kind of a deep research dive. So I went back to graduate school twice. So first in fashion studies, I already had a degree in costume design, and then to get my PhD, which I got in American Studies at Harvard University. And this book was my dissertation project. And now it's a book out there in the world for you to listen to in your ears or read it in your hands.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. And apologize for mispronouncing your name. And it's Chapin. Is that correct?
That's right. That's okay. I'll
All
answer to
right.
either.
Thank you, Dr. Chapin. Um, why did you decide to become a historian?
That's a great question. Um, I think I always was a historian, but I wasn't very good at sitting still and listening. And so I don't think that it was really in my path to start off as a historian. Like I said, I thought about myself more as a maker and creator. But I think a lot of people who like history do theater because it's, in a way to do history on its feet. The theater I started doing was Shakespeare, and that was such a magical world to me. I loved the cadence and the language and all of the sort of heightened feelings that you find in Shakespeare, the love and the revenge and the anger and all of those things. And I loved the costumes and the swords and the crowns and the capes, and it just was such a fantastical world. And I guess for me, that's really how I think about history still, is in three dimension, because that's how I grew up with it. I grew up making it. And so when I became a professional historian by getting a PhD and doing more of the kinds of things that professional historians do, like going into the archives and, reading manuscript material and stuff like that, I always sort of think about it through the lens of the kind of three-dimensional in living color history that I did as a costume designer.
Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to utilize being an artist, being a welder, and being some of the other things that you mentioned, how all of that sort of melded together to, sort of make who you are?
Yeah. I mean, it's a process of discovery, I think. When I first showed up at Harvard, I really felt like such an outsider. I was the only person in most of my classes that didn't already have a degree in whatever it was that we were studying. So I felt very behind, just in terms of the content, and everybody was name dropping all these scholars and books that I'd never heard of. Um, and the maker part of me just didn't feel valued, like there was no place for it there. It was really like a before and after kind of. And so it wasn't really until, and I would say that lasted for a number of years, most of the time that I was in coursework and then doing research and writing. And it wasn't really until the end, I guess I would say that it certainly it really informed my questions. That was always clear. It certainly informed my interests. But it wasn't until maybe later on in the writing process that I felt like I was able to more intentionally blend the sort of act one and act two of my life, if you will forgive the theatrical metaphor. Um, uh, and I really lucked into having an amazing dissertation advisor, Jennifer Roberts, who's a brilliant art historian. And she really is invested in makers. And her sort of special skill was that she could tell me what was missing in what I was writing. And she was always convinced that there were things that I knew as a, trained designer with a practitioner's eye who knew how to make things. She was like, I know there's things that you know or that you can see in this about this painting that you haven't written down yet. You have to show us what you see. Um, and that was very helpful. And, when it went through the peer review process, that was a lot of the feedback that I got was, this book was obviously written by a costume designer, and a lot of them wanted more. Tell us more about what you know. We want to see things through your eyes. But it's very difficult to know what it is that you know, because it's really hard to unknow it. So that was a lot of the process um, of not just writing the book the first time around, the dissertation version, but in translating the dissertation to a book. That was one of the things I was really trying to bring out more of, is, make it as tactile and experiential as I could for the reader who might not have had the same kind of experiences that I've had.
Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing the audiobook in your own voice. So I am enjoying it. So I do want to let you know that. Please talk about your book that was released in June of 2026.
So you asked about my background, so I can tell you about the sort of origin story of the book, which initially was going to be very different. It started off really as a history of tuxedos, of male formal wear, evening dress. And it was sparked really in a conversation with Daniel Radcliffe, the actor, at the opening night party of a Broadway show that I had been design the costumes for Equus a long time ago in 2008. Um, and he was wearing a blue tuxedo, and I complimented him on it. And so we started chatting about it, and he told me this, he's English, and so the English have a very different relationship with formal dress. And he told me about the history of the British aristocracy wearing midnight blue tuxedos. And I just thought that was such an interesting story and got my
Mm.
mind sparked. And, you know, as I was thinking about taking on research projects and maybe thinking about doing a PhD, I was trying to find like what was a research question that I was interested in. And that seemed like an interesting one. And then a couple years later, I was doing research for a production of the opera La Traviata, which starts with a fancy dress ball on stage. And so the question was, what should the male chorus be wearing? And the answer is almost always white tie or tails, because that's what's in stock for the performers. But I thought, well, in 1850, was that really a uniform yet? It was such an innocent question at the time. I thought, in my mind, I thought I could see like, oh, maybe some of them were wearing black vests or black bow ties instead of white. Um, but I couldn't really picture, I had this sort of hole in my memory between about 1820 and 1850. The Regency period, I think, is quite easy to imagine. The Victorian period is quite easy to imagine. But there was this period that I couldn't really like picture in my mind. And as a designer, you kind of, develop this mental database of images. So it was a little odd that I had this gap. And then I went back in my mind to the 18th century, and I just was really struck that nobody was wearing black and white in the 18th century, except for, judges and priests and people who were dressed in mourning dress. But it wasn't a fashionable color. Certainly it wasn't associated with formal wear. And in fact, there wasn't any such thing as evening dress in the 18th century. And so there was clear that something had happened in the first half of the 19th century where men all started wearing it. And then, well, I guess I should say that some men started wearing it. And then somehow all men started wearing it, that it wasn't just one option, but it somehow quickly became the only option for evening dress. And by 1850, it was a uniform. And it's
Mm.
barely changed since. And it's a uniform that's more uniform than any other forms of masculine dress, including military uniforms, diplomatic dress uniforms. Like it has barely changed since its inception in the 1820s. And yet it doesn't think of itself as a uniform. And that's really weird. And so that was really the question that brought me back to graduate school. And for the first number of years when I was writing, I was still really thinking about the project as being about evening dress. But there were a bunch of research challenges that I was having. I couldn't quite figure out how to make it work. And I was doing a lot of my research during the pandemic, and I couldn't get into the archives. The archives were all closed. And I was a fellow at the Smithsonian, which has one of the biggest archives in the world, and I couldn't get into it. It was so frustrating. And so I had to look for sources online. And I had heard of the founding fathers online, where they've digitized a lot of the papers of George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And partially I thought, like, does anybody care about those old dead white guys anymore? And then I just thought maybe I'll spend a couple of hours, looking at stuff and see what they might have to say. And I found this whole series of letters that George Washington wrote to his tailor back in London, complaining about how his pants never fit for like 10 years. And I thought that was just remarkable. It's such a relatable story. I frequently feel like my pants don't fit. And George Washington has probably had more books written about him than most other humans on the planet. And yet that is a story that I had never heard before. And I thought that was interesting. So that was part of what prompted me to start looking at the founding fathers, because they their papers were just so available, and it was so easy to search for anything that they might have said about pantaloons or things like
Can you
that.
talk a little bit about why he was still having his tailor from London
Yeah,
speak
it's a good
to
question.
yeah, I mean
Because here's this guy in
that
Virginia. There's plenty of tailors in Virginia, but he was an aristocrat. And we have a hard time thinking about Americans in that language because that was such a part of the rhetoric of the revolution was they wanted to get rid of the aristocracy, or they had a problem with it. And yet a lot of the people who were the founders of the nation really were aristocrats themselves in terms of the money that they had. And he was a successful young planter and owned a huge amount of property, including slaves. And that was what gentlemen did was they ordered their clothes from London. And what one of the things that's interesting in those letters is sometimes he cared a lot about his clothes, and sometimes he's very particular about the kinds of clothes that he wants. But sometimes he just says to the tailor, make it out of something fashionable. And so he's
mm.
really leaving the taste up to the guy in England. And I think that says a lot about how he thought about himself as a fashionable person.
So the fashion that the first president was wearing was driven by the taste of a London tailor.
That's right. And, he didn't keep buying. So by the time he was president, he was not using London tailors. Once once the revolution started, he stopped purchasing things from abroad and started wearing. He went to a tailor in Philadelphia, which he then used for the rest of his presidency, the rest of his life. Um, so he was purchasing local after the revolution. But it was still quite a while that as a young British officer, which he was during the French and Indian War.
That's fantastic. We're going to go to our next question. We have a question from Clarlock Lopez Waterman, Asheville, North Carolina. How does the violent history of our Native American forebears in the United States run up against the suit, where they are forced to wear them?
Yeah, so I would say that before maybe the suit was really associated with the founding fathers, maybe that's where I'll start that story. Um, there was so much exchange of dress goods and textiles in the colonial period. There's plenty of evidence of Native American warriors and leaders getting shirts and coats and blankets and textiles, woolen cloth from Europeans. They were, that was one of the important trade goods. And mostly the Europeans wanted furs. And a lot of what they would trade for would be clothing. And you can see it in portraits how Native American men really styled themselves in this what was probably to them very exotic blend of their own styles and some of the European styles. So, for instance, they would wear these linen shirts, which to Europeans were basically considered underwear. They were invisible because they were always worn under coats and waistcoats. But for the indigenous people, they would wear them as outerwear and then decorate them with like silver armbands and jewelry on top of them. Whereas a lot of the European men adopted native dress, including fringed leather coats and moccasins and fur cloaks. So there was this real cultural blending that was happening in the colonial period up until the revolution. And I think that's an important place to start because it wasn't inevitable that the United States adopted European dress as their own. They had the opportunity to have a different sartorial future that was more blended style, that incorporated more Native American elements. Um, and I think it's important to remember that the suit wasn't inevitable. We have to, that's one of those things that a designer, an artist can do, is take us back and imagine other possibilities. So that's sort of the backstory. But then once the suit was really considered to
Can I
be,
ask you
Mhm.
can I ask you if there is a struggle with the designer um, actually capturing what was actually done versus how they might be inspired by the fusion of the time?
um, well, one thing that's challenging is knowing what the real sartorial landscape was, because most of the images come from Western people, often travelers. And some of them were quite good artists, but you never know who was putting on a costume or, dressing up to mess with the white guy who came in and wanted to everybody to put on their fancy outfits. And there are often stories of Native Americans um, dressing up in silly clothes, like to um, because that was what these white people wanted. And it wasn't necessarily traditional dress. It just was, kind of a costume. Um, but then once suits were adopted, they were seen as a marker of respectability and civility. And that was very powerful to people. And you can see this in the Indian reports, where there were commissioners that were sent around the country to sometimes live with and report on Native American tribes. And
Mm.
some of the evidence for their civility was if they were wearing the appropriate clothing in their minds, which were suits.
By their
And
definition.
exactly. And so you
Okay.
can see in the reports both that they were, being forced to wear suits, but you can also read the resistance too, because of how annoyed the commissioners get that they're not dressing appropriately. So you can see that they didn't want to, but it was really used as a way of civilizing, but also I would say sort of squashing, local culture in a lot of ways.
I want to pause here for just a quick second. So we're showing the two of us as well as the cover of the book right now. And again, I want to share where people can get the book. I think we have an Amazon link, and we want to show the Amazon link. And there is the Amazon link. And I can tell you firsthand, I am enjoying the book through audiobooks. It is amazing. And you get to hear Chloe's voice, Dr. Chloe's voice, as you experience the audio book. Our next question again is from Claudia Lopez Waterman from Asheville, North Carolina. And this question is, what is the current state of suits? Is it still connected to power, or are they too easy to get?
Mhm. My, I guess, rubric for this is I always look at politicians. And politicians aren't the only people who have power, but they're kind of a consolidation of power. And in the book, there I show a couple of pictures of photos from the G20 summit, where you have a bunch of world leaders coming together. I think those photos are really remarkable because it shows the ubiquity of suits. And there are certain people who stand out. Angela Merkel always stood out for her wonderfully colorful suits. Um, Oftentimes, the representative from Saudi Arabia is the only man not wearing a Western suit. Um, and so, if you think about suits as being, or if you think about clothing more broadly as a way to read the stories that people are telling you about themselves, which is how a costume designer thinks about clothes, those pictures are really interesting to read in terms of the messages that you might um, pick up on based on clothing, uh, which I think is just very interesting. So to me, suits have power because they are utilized as a symbol of democracy, of modernity, of respectability, of civility, of formality. Even people who don't normally wear suits will often have one ready to wear to a funeral, to a wedding, to the opera, to court. You know, anytime you need to show up as your best self, to church, um, the suit is always available for you, especially if you are a man. Not always, not all people, not all men wear suits, and not all people who wear suits are men. But I think it's still quite a gendered form of dressing. And it's also connected to a very gendered idea of power as well. And I think that's one of the things that the founding fathers really did. I don't know that they did it intentionally, but when they used the suit, this plain suit, which was very different than the standards of dressing at the time, as a symbol of democracy and equality, it was also something that symbolized masculinity. And so I think in a way they kind of harnessed democracy and equality to white masculinity because those were the people wearing the suits. Anne Hollander, who's a fashion historian who wrote a very well-known book called Sex and Suits, she talks about the suit as being the ethnic dress of white men. And so if we look at it in that
Mm.
respect, then we might ask, well, why is it then that the garment that seems to have the most amount of power in the world is associated with only a particular kind of person? And what does that say about the readability of the political selfhood of anyone, either who doesn't wear a suit or who isn't a white man?
I'm curious as to what you think about the fact that the president of the Ukraine chose to wear what he has worn in these meetings that he has had throughout the last year.
I think it's a very savvy political decision, and I think that it's totally related to the fact that he had a career as an actor before he became a politician. And so
Mm.
he knows what he's doing. And I think he's very savvy in that he is doing it right. There's a video of him giving an interview in the one of his bunkers, and the interviewer points to a suit hanging in it. They go to his closet and they look at all of the. It's not general uniforms, right? There's no shiny epaulettes or medals or anything. It's all camouflage, something that anyone, any soldier would wear. He points to a suit at the back of the closet, and he said, um, he asks about the suit, and Zelenskyy says, I want to wear the suit again, but the suit is for when the war is finished. And that was his message from the beginning. That when he shows up places, he's reminding people without having to say a word that his country is at war. And I think that's
Mm.
very powerful.
Can we talk about the vitriol that President Obama received for wearing that tan suit?
Yeah. So maybe just some historical context that tan suits have been popular for a long time, since the early 20th century. And they were especially common in the summer months because they're typically made out of a lighter weight material, either a lighter weight woolen or often cotton or linen or a blend of those. And so it's very common to see even politicians. It was very common to see politicians in Washington wearing tan suits or white suits up through about the 1960s. There's a little bit of a decline then in popularity because of air conditioning. And so it's not as
Mm.
hot inside in the buildings. And so there's a lot of there's a big change, a lot of changes in men's fashion around the 1960s because of the ability to control the temperature of the indoors through heating and cooling in a way that had not been possible before. But it's still very, it's seen as totally acceptable form of dress. And it was August. So again, like the hottest month of the year. If you've ever lived in
Hmm.
Washington, D.C., you know that it's today here in Boston, it was like over 90 degrees and it was very muggy outside. I would not want to be wearing a dark woolen suit on a day like today. So the
Absolutely.
critique was actually not about him wearing a suit, but what he was wearing it for. He was giving a press conference and he was talking about terrorism. And so it was the political right that critiqued him, who said that it was inappropriate for the subject matter. But the thing that is really interesting is that oftentimes when politicians get critiqued for their clothing, it's it's often clearly not about the clothing, and it's just using the clothing as an opportunity for a political critique that they wanted to make anyway. And so the critique was not that Obama was um, wearing a suit that didn't look good. It was that not only was it inappropriate for the subject matter, but it showed his moral shortcomings, that he would not know the difference. There was an implication that that meant that he was untrustworthy, and that we couldn't, you know, he was unfit for making these kind of important decisions as the president. And people on the political left immediately called it out for being, a critique about race and not about fashion, by showing
Wow.
pictures of Republican presidents and other politicians wearing, like George Bush, um, Mitch McConnell. There were a number, especially the Southern senators. They're always wearing tan suits. So
Right.
it clearly was really more of a political attack than a fashion
Wow.
critique.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That gives us a framework that has not been shared. So thank you so much for sharing that. We appreciate that. Can you talk about the social significance of the way we dress, and is that a form of protest that exists in clothes that we wear? Is this a part of the form of protest that exists? Is there? What do you think?
I think there's lots of reasons why people wear what they wear, and protest seems to be a really good one. I know when I was a teenager, I was a very angsty teenager, and I felt like a fighter, and I didn't feel like I fit in. And you could tell that immediately by how I dressed. I shaved my head, and I always had different dyed colored hair, and for a while I wore a biker jacket and wallet change and combat boots, and I looked like a punk rocker or a skater kid. I mean, you
If
can
I had
still
known, I would have
see,
asked for some pictures.
I'm still clearly coloring my hair in a way that is, I would say, showing that I'm, resisting maybe a conventional form of femininity, or what a woman is supposed to be like or do with her hair when she is aging. So that's, my version maybe of protest, but there are much, and that's just sort of in terms of like my personality. You can see other forms of protest on a much larger, maybe political stage. Um, you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. when we were talking earlier today. You can look at all sorts of civil rights movements or women's suffrage movements, where people have found a kind of a costume, and I don't want that to sound pejorative, but they've come up with a way of dressing that is helping them get their message across, that unites them. I think that's one of the things that clothing can do very well, is bring people together, whether that's around your favorite musicians, t-shirts, sports jerseys really brings people together. We've seen that with the World Cup
Oh
games
yeah.
in recent days. Um, so I agree that protest is something that can be maybe advertised and communicated and have a feeling of belonging. Maybe another good example would be like it's well, I guess it's July today, but June is also Pride Month, and so
Hmm.
people wearing Pride related T-shirts or pins. That's another sort of
Watch
common.
bands.
Yes, exactly. Way to announce either who you are or that you're an ally or that, you're a safe person to talk to or something like that. Um, I don't know that I would put MAGA hats necessarily in the category of protest, but I would say that's another clear sartorial signal that's very common today in our country that is clearly saying a message and probably really um, doing quite a good job at both uniting certain people and then also making it clear, sort of like us versus them. That's one of the stories that clothing is really good at telling, sort of a
It's
costume designer 101 trick. If you're designing Romeo and Juliet, you got to have the Capulets in one color and the Montagues in another color, and you can tell who's on whose team. That's one thing that clothes does really well.
I was just wondering, other than the MAGA hats, is there something else that jumps out at you as a signaling attire?
Well, that's a particularly clear one. Um, I would say, again, maybe pride related. The rainbow flag is another particularly common one these days. Um, Nothing else jumps into mind right now. I
Okay.
guess we could, it's almost the 4th of July. I think I've seen a lot of conversations about who is allowed to be patriotic or who should be patriotic, and if
Yeah, I was
patriotism
just going to
is,
ask you about the wearing of the flag and how that has galvanized some people and on made some people very uncomfortable in the flag being used as sort of a weapon.
yeah.
Um, yeah, maybe you have a little bit more
Well,
that you want to
maybe
talk
a
about on that
more
part.
immediately answerable version is any time the Confederate flag is used. I think that's quite
Mm.
a clear symbol, which seems to have a very particular political resonance. The American flag, I think, is a little bit trickier because I think there's a way in which that the political right has kind of tried to appropriate patriotism and sort of claim it as their own, and I think that the political left has had to do some really deep thinking about whether or not they want to align themselves with patriotism and what does that mean and how should it look. So I think it's a really active question in the country. And that's one of the things I think is so interesting about fashion is that it allows us to explore these open questions, not just intellectually, but I think in our day-to-day lives.
It's so interesting that people are still 2026 wrestling with this idea of identity, and to me it seems as if sometimes it is both conscious and unconscious in terms of the way in which we look at this idea of dress and suit and can you talk about a little bit more about the psychology of the
Yeah,
things that we recognize when it comes to clothing and the things that we don't?
yeah. I think that's a good question, and I think there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. One would be about your own clothing, and one would be about the clothing of other people. So, in terms of the psychology of the self, you can, I think a lot of us wear clothing um, in unconsidered way. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're unfashionable, but just that you're not really thinking about it very deeply. You know, maybe you're a person who doesn't like to go shopping, and so you just kind of wear the same clothes that you've always worn. Or maybe you're a person who loves shopping, but you just kind of go out there and buy what fits you or what's trendy, or maybe even you're very fashionable and you follow all the fashion blogs or the style influencers on Instagram. But then what you're doing is you're looking just for the thing that someone else is telling you to wear. I would say, from a psychological perspective, what I find interesting is people who think very deeply about their own sense of self and the kind of identity that they want to share with the world through their clothing, how they want to feel in their clothing, the kind of ethical decisions that they want to make about where their clothing is coming from, which may or may not be visible to others. So that's where I would say that the psychology of the self is quite interesting through the lens of clothing, is how deeply considered you are being about what you wear, and maybe even how much you own too, you know, how big your closet is. And then there's the psychology of this, of the other self, maybe how you read other people. One of the things that I'm hoping that this book does, I think a lot of fashion history, a lot of fashion theory, this is more maybe for the academics, but read a little bit more like you can judge a book by the cover, that what you see is what you get. You know, in the even the you know, stories about kind of style icons like Katharine Hepburn or Marlene Dietrich, or you know, these very glamorous people or edgy people or people who made a big splash, Grace Kelly, that they are just seen as, the fashion is seen as showing who the personality is. It's like a gateway to the person. But I think that clothing is, I think that that can be true, but I think there are more stories to say, one of which, as you say, is wearing clothing in protest, or a lot of times people feel pressured to wear certain kinds of clothing, whether that's through actual dress codes, like at a, you know, school dress code, or if you work in the military, or even in a profession that requires a certain kind of, you know, uniform, like lawyers generally wear suits, or just feeling pressured, you know, people who feel pressure to wear their hair long or cut their hair short, or have facial hair or not have facial hair, or have their hair be natural or straightened, or you know, dress more masculine or more feminine. I think there's a lot of even unspoken dress codes that people sort of feel like they should follow, even if it's not necessarily showing their true identity or the way that they're happiest in the world.
And doors open and close based on how particular people perceive them even before they open their mouths. You know, it's it's kind of a thing.
Have
I'm
you
kind of
experienced that,
reflective.
Tony?
Absolutely, I have. I've experienced it as a young child. I've experienced it as a young adult, and the way in which I experienced it was that there were times when when I grew up, my parents made sure that we were dressed every day to, I mean, not every day, but every Sunday when we would go to worship, we were dressed impeccably. I mean, we had on suits and shirts and ties. So I have four other brothers and two sisters. There's seven of us, and my parents went to extreme lengths to make sure that we were dressed nice every Sunday. It was important to them because they saw that as part of their worship experience. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what I was able to do from that experience, I was able to take that attire that was meant for worship and actually have an experience with an interviewer for a job, and the question would be, "You look so nice. Um, do you carry yourself like this anytime you're interviewing?" And it was not meant as necessarily a comment. Um, it has been a positive experience being well dressed, and it's been a negative experience. And the reason I say that is because it's almost immediate when you are in that space whether someone is seeing you as you should not be able to dress like that or look
Yeah.
like that. How dare you be able to? You are, and I've had this said to me, you dress better than I do. And I'm the boss, and you dress better than I do. And so that's been said.
Hmm.
Um, and there are tons and tons of, as I said, there are tons and tons of experiences that I've had in my 68 years that have been positive and negative based on the way in which I present myself.
Yeah.
And
For wearing
so
the same
that,
thing.
yeah, for wearing the
So
same thing.
maybe
That's exactly.
this is the an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. So in in trying to decide how to tell the story, I decided not to just tell it chronologically. The book is about the change in men's suits between the American Revolution and the Civil War, and the way that American men and men around the world went from dressing in brightly colored, variable clothing to plain uniform suits. I call this the shift from peacocks to penguins. Um,
Hmm.
and there's a bigger argument there that I kind of already went into about what happens when the founding fathers associate these plain suits with democracy and modernity. Um, but I didn't want it to just be a fashion history where it was like first they wear this and then they wear this and then they wear this and then they wear this. And so the chapters, there's 5 chapters, and they each have a different theme. And it's sort of the lens through which I'm looking at suits. And so those themes are visual, material, embodied, performed, and institutional. So the first is kind of like an art history, fashion history approach. It's really like what were they wearing and how did it change? It kind of gives you the whole overview of the history. But it's thinking really more about the visual aspect, the color, the pattern, the silhouette. And then the second chapter is the material chapter. And so that's really looking at the textile. So, why did they change from silk to woolen, even if they were all black? Why did the shirts that they were wearing underneath change from linen to cotton? How did they go from being machine made to hand, or from handmade to machine made? Um, Things like that. And a little bit of how they were made. But then the third chapter, the embodied chapter, is really about how we feel in our clothes.
Mm.
That's where you'll find those letters that George Washington wrote to his tailor about his pants not fitting. You get some developments in the history of tailoring that shows new cutting patterns and the invention of the tape measure and how the tailors are thinking about the body. And then there's a little bit of psychology in terms of how we feel in our clothes. And then in chapter 4, that's the chapter I call Performed. Well, the chapter title is Suits in the Streets. So that's what happens when you take this like visual, material, felt, embodied thing, and then you go out and you have to interact with other people. And so that's where I think a lot of what you're talking about comes into play. So, Tony, you'll have to let me know when you get to chapter 4 what you think of it.
I will
And that's
do
where you
that.
get things
Absolutely.
like
And let's
etiquette
let's
and
let's
manners
ask.
and
I'm
dress
going to ask my team
codes.
to just share the link to. I'm
Great.
sorry. Go continue, but I want them to share the link so that people can actually go out and buy the book.
Okay. So I'm talking about chapter 4 while everyone's clicking on that link, which is about, dress codes and etiquette and manners. And you'll find a number of stories very similar, Tony, to what you were just talking about, which is um, I call it the authenticity gap, this perceived gap between how you're dressing and who you really are. And there was all this fear in the 19th century about, painted ladies and con men who were going to trick you into believing that they were respectable when really they weren't. Um, but there's also a way in which um, there's this policing that happens of other people saying you shouldn't be wearing those things, even if other people are wearing those things. So I talk about it sort of through the lens of passing. And that word is usually used in the 19th century to refer to racial passing, which I talk about a little bit. But I also talk about passing in terms of class, that people are dressing kind of above their station, or that is how other people are perceiving it.
I
Or,
want to interrupt you and go to a question from Clarlock
great.
Lopez Waterman,
Okay.
which sort of speaks to that. So he says, in your book, you talk about passing, both for different minorities and for women. What surprised you most about that research?
Um, I think really just how important dress is in the ability to pass across many different categories, again, including race, gender, class, even ability. One character that I find really interesting in the book is Ellen Craft, who was enslaved in Georgia with her husband, William, and they escaped to freedom. And her owner was her biological father, so she was half white, or at least half white. And so she passed as a white man. She dressed up in a suit. She was a trained ladies' maid, so she tailored a suit to fit herself, dressed as a white man with her darker skinned husband, cast as her enslaved attendant, on the train voyage that they were taking. Um, and so it's a very interesting story because she's passing on in so many categories. She's passing as white, she's passing as a man, she's passing as wealthy. And she also was passing as disabled because she wore a bandage on her hand to as an excuse for not being able to write, because enslaved people were not allowed to learn how to read and write. She didn't want that to give her away. So that
Wow.
was a sort of interesting character I found,
Mm.
and just how important clothing is in that capacity. But it also, I think, takes the fixedness of categories in order to pass. If America had been maybe a more inclusive place that wasn't so afraid of um, difference, that there wouldn't have needed to be such rigid categories in the first place that required passing.
Wow. You know, I was very much aware of passing when it came to race, but I was not aware the way in which you spoke to passing in other categories, and that you just gave me something else to think about. So thank you for sharing that. Um, wow, wow. I'm just gonna say, um, please talk about why. Well, you just shared. I was gonna say the question was, please talk about why escaped slaves thought it was important to wear suits once they escaped.
Well, I do
So,
have maybe something else to say about that, which is you can see in the runaway slave ads are such a useful archive for understanding how enslaved people thought about their own dress, both because it includes the dress that they wore, but also the clothing that they stole. And it really shows their material literacy, that they knew how important it was to dress for a variety of locations or occasions. And that's clear in the clothes that they leave with. Um, and I think we tend to think about literacy mostly through the ability to read and write words. But there is a real literacy in terms of being able to understand other forms of communication, including clothing.
Mm,
And textiles are something that I think not a lot of people today really understand very well. And even me, I'm trained as a maker. I know how to sew. I've done some weaving. I'm pretty, hands-on person. But the kinds of textile knowledge that people had in the 18th century, including people who didn't know how to read and write, is absolutely extraordinary.
mm,
And it just shows you how people are seeing the world in a different way that we can't imagine today.
amazing, amazing. Unfortunately, we're down to our last two questions. I'm a little disappointed. I'll be honest with you in terms of this hour went extremely fast. What's next for you?
Well, partially, I think it's just having conversations like this and talking with people about the book now that it's out. And that's been really fun. There's so many different types of people who have been interested in this book or touched by this book, and that is so interesting to me to get to have different conversations with people who find meaning in lots of different ways. Um, but the next book project that I'm working on is more of a deep history of clothing, kind of the archaeology of clothing. I'm going back to the earliest evidence of dress and adornment in human culture, including Neanderthal culture, and thinking about the longevity of adorning the body. It's kind of a counterpoint to the suit. One of the arguments that I kind of came to maybe towards the end of the project is humans have been decorating their bodies since humans existed. Adornment is really the norm for humans, and plainness is the outlier. And that's what you see in the suit. And that's really an anomaly and really worth paying attention to.
So no fig leaf attire?
Yeah, we can include that. Hard to find in the archaeological record, but that story in the Bible is one of the earliest written records of dress, so it should be in there.
Okay. So our final question for tonight is you're speaking to the world. What do you want the world to know besides buying suitable?
I think it's related to what I was just saying, that plainness is not a neutral term, that it has a design, it has a material, it has a cost, and it has consequences. Um, and the suit, I think, was designed to be hard to see, maybe not intentionally, but by its very design, it has remained overlooked as maybe one of the most powerful visual symbols in the world or forms of media. Um, and we should pay attention to things that have power, for good or for bad, but we should pay attention to them. And the suit is something that we haven't been able to see, I don't think. So that's one of the things that I hope this book does, is just allow people to see it and then decide what we want to do about it.
One of the questions that we had that we did not ask was what do you think about this idea of why the idea of women wearing power suits was so disruptive? And unfortunately, we've run out of time. But another one I want to throw out there, just so that you so that you can
Yeah.
think about this and our audience can think about it, is why, and do your research. Why did Dr. King have a nickname called Tweed, and how that might have affected the civil rights movement? And we're going to leave you hanging with that, and we're just going to go to the closing of our show. So maybe we can have Dr. Chapin come back again to get into some of those and other questions. Again, we want to thank her so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for
Again,
having me, Tony.
thank you. I am very happy to have had you, and thank you for our mutual friend inviting you to participate in this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Chloe Chapin. Thank you again for being a part of our conversation today and for doing the work suitable, doing the work, and being the person who you are. You can watch Conversation with Tony Mobley on YouTube or our website, conversationwithtonymobley.com. Conversation with Tony Mobley is produced by Clark Lopez Waterman. Our current team is Laura Thompson, Zachary Sorensen, Mickey McAture. Thank you, Clark and our team, so much for what you do. Thank you, Mimo Live. Thank you, Zoom. We have conversations with real people. Next week on Conversation with Tony Mobley, we're going to have an educational panel on where we are in education right now. There are some interesting things happening, so we're going to talk about that with our panel next week. Please feel free to donate your time, your talent, or your financial gift to Conversations with Tony Mobley. We are committed to getting better, and your support makes that possible. We'd also love to have you join us for our growing community. Like, subscribe, and please make a comment on YouTube so that we can keep getting better and having more meaningful conversations here at Conversations with Tony Mobley. We believe that when people sit down and truly talk, something powerful happens. So consider having a conversation today. It just might change everything. Please take care wherever you are in the world. We will see you soon. Take care. Good night or good day, depending on where you are. That early experience